It's 1978 and we're in Cambodia. Even in December, the days here are warm, around 30 degrees Celsius. It's 3 days before Christmas, and we're in a guest house on one of the main avenues in Phnom Penh. There are 3 people staying here, 2 journalists and a professor. They're Westerners, and they've been invited here by Cambodia's communist government, enjoying a tour of the country. The 22nd of December, 1978, is the last day of their tour. They've been here for 2 weeks, and they've just found out that as a parting gift, they've been granted a private audience with the Prime Minister, Communist dictator Pol Pot. Pol Pot's regime is marred with controversy. Reports of mass murder, mass starvation, and forced unpaid labour have been making their way into the outside world. But until this point, no Western journalists have seen it for themselves. These 3 will be the first Westerners to be granted an audience with the man at the centre of it all. One of the guests, Malcolm Caldwell, is particularly excited. He's a Marxist revolutionary and a huge admirer of Pol Pot. But just hours after he meets his hero, Malcolm is shot dead. 5 decades later, why Malcolm died that night remains a mystery. Had he got himself caught up in a wider political game? Had he put a target on his back by befriending one of the world's most infamous dictators? Or was he murdered on the orders of Pol Pot himself? This is True Crime Reports, a global crime show from Al Jazeera. Today, the murder of Malcolm Caldwell. Let's go back. Scotland, 1931. This is where Malcolm is born, in a market town called Stirling. The son of a coal miner, he's smart, engaged with the world, and he grows into a tall, slender man with a strong gaze, a goatee, and blazing auburn hair. Malcolm moves to England to study for his PhD. He meets his wife, Anne, and they'll go on to have 4 children. But aside from his family and whiskey, Malcolm's true passion is politics. He becomes an adult just as the Cold War is exploding on the global stage. And in the fight between capitalism and communism, Malcolm is firmly on the side of the revolutionary communists. He starts writing and gets involved in the anti-nuclear movement. He becomes an outspoken critic of American foreign policy. Like many others at this time, the Vietnam War is a particular sticking point. At this time, there's a young reporter for the Washington Post who'll come to know Malcolm very well. Her name is Elizabeth Becker.
As a person, he was very funny, very charming, clearly intelligent, and someone you'd want to sit next to at dinner. He had a disheveled look about him, which made him seem less aggressive, and an easygoing kind of way.
Malcolm becomes a history professor in London, and his students love him. They'll describe him as friendly and an unconventional character. Now, one country that Malcolm becomes very interested in is Cambodia. In 1967, when Malcolm is 36 years old, Cambodia breaks out in civil war. The communist revolutionaries, the Khmer Rouge, are on one side, and the US-backed governments are on the other. After 8 years of war, the communist revolutionaries win. The Khmer Rouge takes charge. Their leader, Pol Pot, shuts the country off to the outside world, and it becomes a radical communist state. His aim is to create a Cambodian master race, and in years to come, comparisons will be drawn between his Cambodia and Nazi Germany. Cities are evacuated, and the population is forced into unpaid agricultural labour. The brutal persecution of ethnic minorities begins, and dissidents are purged. Leisure activities are severely restricted, and gatherings of 3 people or more risk accusations of conspiracy and possible execution. Schools are turned into interrogation camps. The most notorious camp is called S21 and will hold around 14,000 prisoners during the Khmer Rouge's rule. Only 12 will survive. The Khmer Rouge will only rule for 4 years, but it's estimated that over 2 million Cambodians lose their lives during that time from disease, starvation, execution, or exhaustion from forced labor.
For the average Cambodian, the 4 years that the Khmer Rouge were in charge were terrible.
Sophal is a political scientist, and he was just a baby in Phnom Penh when the Khmer Rouge took over.
My father and a brother are lost to the Khmer Rouge revolution, and a quarter of the population died during that period, from 1975 to 1979.
Over in London, though, Malcolm sees none of this horror with his own eyes. There have been some accounts from refugees who've escaped Cambodia and tell stories of mass starvation, labour camps and arbitrary executions. But for Malcolm, it's the theory that matters. Pol Pot's trying to create a communist utopia. Malcolm's fascinated. Here's Elizabeth Becker again, the reporter from the Washington Post.
He didn't have a view of him per se as a human being. He had a view of him as a leader, and he considered his leadership bold and, these are my words, not his, but forward-thinking, imaginative, well-meaning.
In April 1978, he writes a book praising Pol Pot's vision, and the following month he publishes an article in the British newspaper The Guardian. It's titled The Cambodian Defence, and for many people, it's an unsettling read. Here's Sophal.
Among the academics who studied Cambodia, Malcolm's argument was not unusual. The argument that some of them made certainly was, you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. People have got to die in order to move forward and have that revolution.
So as the winter of 1978 arrives, this is where we're at. We've got Pol Pot, 3 years into a brutal communist dictatorship, with the blood of millions of Cambodians on his hands. By this point, he's in a tricky situation. He's made an enemy of the US in the fallout of the Cambodian Civil War, and tensions with bordering Vietnam are at an all-time high. If war with Vietnam does break out, Pol Pot needs international help. For that, he needs the West to like him. And over in Scotland, around 10,000 kilometres away, he's got an unlikely ally in Malcolm Caldwell. So this is what Pol Pot does. He decides to invite some sympathetic allies over. He'll wine and dine them and hopefully get their support. They'll be the first outsiders to be allowed in. The guests are chosen and the invite sent. Here's Sophal.
Pol Pot's invitation of 3 Westerners to go into Cambodia was huge. Bringing these 3 Westerners in was a way of spinning things differently, hoping perhaps that he could pull the wool over the eyes of these individuals.
Malcolm Caldwell receives one of the invitations. An American journalist called Richard Dudman receives another, and the third is sent to Elizabeth Becker. Elizabeth had lived in Cambodia years before as a war correspondent, and she'd been dying to return to learn the truth about the regime.
The reaction was simply, finally, I can go. Finally, I hope I can come back with a story.
They accept, and in December 1978, they fly to Phnom Penh. Now, the trio are in very different minds. Malcolm and Richard are both sympathetic to the Khmer Rouge, but Elizabeth, 32 at this point, sticks out. She's suspicious about what's really going on in Cambodia's highly secretive state. She wants to know the truth about the horrific stories she's read about murder and forced labor.
Very quickly, it was clear that I was the more skeptical. I was the more appalled. They both thought I was being too hard on Cambodians, and they were more likely to take everything at face value than I was. So I was very definitely the odd person out.
The three Westerners are met at the airport in Phnom Penh by two Mercedes sedans. They're driven to a guest house on one of the city's main streets, Monivong Avenue. This will be their home for the next 2 weeks. Elizabeth will be staying in an ensuite on the first floor. Malcolm and Richard's rooms are on the floor above. They unpack their bags and the tour begins. They'll be shown around by a senior government official called Tuin Prosit. Being shown around Phnom Penh, the three visitors find squeaky clean streets, almost stage-set perfection. No litter, no dirt, picture-perfect parks, immaculate lawns, beautiful flower beds. But it's eerily quiet.
Well, we landed in Phnom Penh, and I was shocked. The city I had known and lived in wasn't there. There were no people on the street. It was without life. Everything was closed. All the temples, all the churches, all the mosques, the schools. There are no markets. There are no shops.
Richard will later describe the Phnom Penh they saw as a Hiroshima without the destruction, a Pompeii without the ashes. For 3 days, they explore the city. Then they leave for the Cambodian countryside. At this point, Cambodia is known as Kampuchea. Here's Sophal.
The tour was a well-orchestrated, coordinated attempt to show a side of democratic Kampuchea that the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot wanted these Westerners to see, which would have been happy laborers, workers who maybe in factories, of the few factories that remained that were seemingly well-fed, nobody starving, nobody dying, certainly nobody being beaten in front of them.
For Elizabeth, the PR curtain slips just once. As their car continues through the Cambodian countryside, they pass a line of children carrying firewood. They're thin, barefoot, and in rags. The guests are told they're students learning about farming. Elizabeth and Malcolm begin to bicker. She feels she's seeing a fake Cambodia. Malcolm, backed up by Richard, tells her she's wrong.
They were not seeing what was missing. It showed a total lack of respect for Cambodian life. I mean, everything had been taken away from them. Everything.
The 2 weeks fly by, and the group returns to Phnom Penh. It's the 19th of December, and their trip is coming to an end. To celebrate, Elizabeth, Malcolm, and Richard are invited to dinner with the Deputy Prime Minister, Ieng Sary. Amazingly, we have access to audio from that dinner. Here's Ieng welcoming his guests.
So, this night, I have to offer an informal dinner between among the...
Ieng asks his guests what they think of Cambodia.
No, you have visited a big part of our country. What are your opinions?
We're still observing and still asking questions.
Over dinner, Elizabeth fires questions at Ieng about human rights and the welfare of the general population. Ieng deflects them. It will later be reported that Elizabeth is so inquisitive, government officials think she's an undercover agent for the CIA. Malcolm has questions of his own. He's upset at the prospect of Cambodia and Vietnam fighting and wants them to unite. But Ieng disagrees. He tells Malcolm that Cambodia's communists won the civil war on their own, without outside help. Other countries could do the same. That's not what Malcolm wants to hear. He withdraws for the rest of the evening. Elizabeth later writes,
He was watching his long-held dream of revolutionary cooperation disappear before his own eyes and was badly shaken.
3 days pass. It's the 22nd of December, 1978, a Friday. It's the last day of Elizabeth, Malcolm and Richard's trip, and they've just been told something they hadn't been expecting. As a parting gift, they've been granted an audience with the man himself, Prime Minister Pol Pot. Richard and Elizabeth, the journalists, will go in together. Malcolm, who's there as a friend of the regime, will go in alone.
I thought, oh goodness, I might get something out of this trip. I mean, it was such a hard trip. I thought, well, at least I'll get Pol Pot.
They're taken to the former governor's palace, a grand building on the waterfront that dates back to French colonial times. Elizabeth and Richard will meet him first. Elizabeth says the dictator was very different to how she expected.
He was much more elegant and charming and good-looking than I expected. He was very well-groomed. He had a beautiful Mao suit on. He had a lovely smile. He was not what I expected.
Elizabeth and Richard settle down to ask their questions, but they can't get a word in edgeways. What should have been an interview turns into a 2-hour lecture from Pol Pot about the struggles facing the Cambodian people. Amazingly, Elizabeth records the meeting. It's faint, but you can just make out what Pol Pot's saying. He says the struggle that Kampuchea, meaning Cambodia, is facing is independence and territorial integrity.
So the struggle of the Cambodian people and of democratic Cambodia to defend their independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity is also to defend the Cambodia, but it's also a contribution to the defense of independence and peace in Southeast Asia and in the world.
He tells them of his worries that Vietnam is about to invade.
Maybe they can succeed in some place in the attack, but they cannot succeed to take possession of Cambodia.
And asks for America and NATO to support him in that fight.
The Constitution of Democratic Cambodia reflects the deep wishes of the Cambodian people who want to live in good relation with all countries, including the United States of America and its people, the American people.
About 2 hours later, Elizabeth and Richard emerge from the room. And then it's Malcolm's turn. Nobody knows what happens in that room, but Malcolm emerges sometime later, a very happy man. He's euphoric, jubilant. He said they'd discussed revolutionary economic theory and that Pol Pot had even invited Malcolm back to visit again next year. He said he'd love to, as long as it wasn't over Christmas. He didn't want to be away from his family again. That night, after Richard goes to bed, Elizabeth and Malcolm argue for the final time. Malcolm tries to convince Elizabeth that the communist revolution had been worthy. Elizabeth disagrees. She's more convinced by the refugees' accounts. Malcolm tries one last time to change her mind, but she's not having it. At around midnight, they go to bed, exhausted but happy to have made it. Here's Elizabeth Becker again.
Shortly after midnight, I heard what I thought was a garbage can and dogs barking.
She gets out of bed and rushes to the door. She opens it and steps into the corridor outside. There's a man standing there and he's pointing a gun at her.
He's about to shoot, and I say no in Khmer, ate, and I ran back into my bedroom, and as we were taught in the war, I went and hid in the bathtub.
Elizabeth, hiding in her ensuite, hears the man with the gun move upstairs. Meanwhile, Richard, who's staying on the floor above, has also heard the gunshots. He'd gone to the window of his bedroom and had seen about 6 men running down the street. He'd gone out to his balcony and watched more men running. He goes back inside, walks across his bedroom and out into the corridor. He knocks on Malcolm's door, and the 2 men talk briefly, quietly. all of a sudden, the man with the gun appears. He shoots at the ground and Richard runs back inside his room. He locks the door. Richard and Elizabeth, both in their rooms, one floor apart, hear more gunshots and then silence.
Now, all I knew, I'm in my bedroom, I'm hiding, I hear all the gunshots, and I know nothing. And I think the Vietnamese must have started the war.
Elizabeth stays in her room, no idea what's going on. Eventually, after what feels like hours, their guide, Tuin Prosit, arrives. Malcolm's dead, he says. Elizabeth goes upstairs. Malcolm's lying on the floor in his pajamas, his wild auburn hair shining even in the nighttime dark.
At this point, I was feeling all that adrenaline and fear was all over. And then the sadness on top of that, it was almost paralyzing. But there he was. And beside him was the body of the assassin, who was clearly Cambodian.
The night passes in a state of utter confusion. And then the sun rises, and a hasty memorial for Malcolm is arranged. It's at the guest house. Elizabeth and Richard are joined by their guide and Ieng Sary, the Deputy Prime Minister. Malcolm's body is laid out in a simple wooden casket, surrounded by bouquets of flowers. His face is pale and peaceful. He's 47 years old. The mourners bow their heads in silence. Some cry. Ieng gives a short eulogy. He blames Vietnam for what's happened and expresses his country's deepest regrets for the death of Malcolm Caldwell. The memorial is over, and on that same day, with 2 days left before Christmas, Elizabeth and Richard leave Cambodia. And back in the UK, news of Malcolm's murder reaches his family. One of his sons, Richard, will later say, "I don't even remember who called. It must have been my mum. I just remember being told he was dead. It was chilling news." He goes on to say, "To this day, we don't know why he was killed, and I'm not sure we ever will." And that's the question. Who killed Malcolm and why? 2 weeks later, 4 guards at the guest house are arrested. 2 of them confess. They say they wanted to undermine the Khmer Rouge regime. However, this confession has been widely contested. The guards had been taken to the Khmer Rouge's notorious S21 prison and tortured. For many people, or for those few who still remember Malcolm's name, a different theory persists. Some historians and journalists, and some of Malcolm's family, believe he was murdered on the orders of Pol Pot himself, possibly following a disagreement in their private conversation just hours before. Elizabeth thinks it's possible Malcolm's assassin was someone from within the inner circle, but she says there isn't necessarily any logic to the death.
Their record of murders was so irrational that I find it ridiculous that somehow I'm supposed to find out what's rational about their murder of Malcolm.
So what happens next? Well, in the Malcolm Caldwell story, the official narrative is that the killers were found. On the 5th of January 1979, all 4 guards from the guest house were executed. And for Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge, well, Vietnam invaded Cambodia on Christmas Day 1978, 3 days after Malcolm's death. Pol Pot fled Phnom Penh and escaped into the jungle. He lived out the rest of his years in exile. He was eventually arrested by his own associates 20 years later, but died in 1998 before charges could be brought against him for his reign of terror. In 2005, a war crimes tribunal was set up to investigate the horrors committed by the Khmer Rouge. 3 of the regime's top leaders were convicted. Today, Phnom Penh's S21 prison is a genocide museum, dedicated to the memory of the millions of Cambodians who lost their lives to the Khmer Rouge regime. Here's Sophal.
For so many people in Cambodia who didn't live through it, there's also a kind of amnesia or an inability to accept that this even happened. We all want to believe that, monsters don't look like us, but they do. It's the banality of evil. It's just, it happens over and over again. We talk about never again, but it keeps happening. It's a complicated thing, Cambodia, and today that legacy continues to reverberate.
This was True Crime Reports, a global crime show from Al Jazeera. In our next episode, we're in modern-day Cambodia, where right now people are being trafficked and forced to work in the highly lucrative scamming industry. Thank you for joining. See you next week.